Have you ever imagined a scene like this, one late afternoon on the frontier? The dry wind cut through the cottonwoods, the sun sagging behind the ridge, and just when you thought all you'd hear was the breath of your horse and the jingle of tack, a figure suddenly appeared in the shallow creek. Not a rugged drifter, not a grizzled wanderer, but a young Apache woman, eyes wide with panic, trembling in the water. Her clothes had been torn from her body, only scraps clinging to bruised skin, and her voice, hoarse from thirst and weeping, slashed the air like a knife. "They stole my clothes. Cowboy, please help me. Before I take you deeper into this tale, let me pause. Moments like these aren't only in storybooks. If your heart just skipped a beat, if you've ever witnessed injustice or felt the desperation of someone cornered, then hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Every word you share keeps these Western stories alive. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you won't just see fear and hardship, but also the rise of courage and the spark of a bond strong enough to change a life. Now, let's return to Jack Callahan. Jack was 38, a man carrying too many shadows from his past. Half his life had been tied to smoke and gunpowder, once a scout for the army. He'd seen what men could do when no law was watching. 3 years back, spring fever had taken his wife, leaving only a lonely cabin on the edge of the plains. Since then, he buried himself in work mending fence, tending stock, chores to keep his hands busy and his heart numb. For Jack, silence and vigilance had become second nature, the kind where even the snap of a twig in the woods made his hand drift toward the rifle. That evening, he rode out just to check the water for the herd, but instead of deer tracks or a coyote's trail, Jack found Lena. The sight froze him to the marrow. She stood knee-deep in the creek, long hair soaked and clinging down her back, her shoulders curled like a hunted creature, bare feet torn from running, arms purpled with bruises. She didn't cry, only lifted a trembling hand toward the bank where scraps of fabric lay scattered in the mud. Those dark eyes locked on him, fierce with fear and suspicion. Was he a rescuer or just another predator? Jack didn't answer right away. His mind ran through the dangers. Maybe the men who hurt her still lurked nearby. Maybe bringing her back meant bringing trouble to his own door. But when he looked into her eyes, hollow with despair, yet begging for mercy, he pushed the doubts aside. Slowly, he shrugged off his worn sheepskin coat, held it out in plain sight. She snatched it quick, turning away, clutching it tight across her body. He gave a small nod, letting her know no words were needed. He stepped down the bank and took her elbow gently, lifting her out of the cold water. Her knees buckled. She couldn't hold herself upright. Without thinking, Jack scooped her up, carried her to the horse, and set her across the saddle. She clung to the back of his shirt with trembling hands, fingers digging into the fabric as if life itself depended on it. The ride home stretched long and dim beneath the falling sun. Dust lifted with each hoofbeat, the sky bruising into purple. Jack felt her shivers against his back, not the chill of creek water, but the deeper shaking of terror and shame. His chest tightened with a slow-burning anger, mixed with a sympathy he hadn't felt in years. When they reached the cabin, he swung down first and steadied her as she nearly collapsed. Inside, the single lantern threw yellow light across rough plank walls. Jack wrapped her in a wool blanket, kindled the fire, set water to boil. Without a word, he pulled out needle and thread, sat at the table, and began patching together what was left of her dress. The stitches were uneven, clumsy even, but careful, deliberate. Like each pull of the thread was a vow not to let the world finish breaking her. Lena sat by the fire, eyes fixed on his hands as if trying to decide whether this man could be trusted. That night, Jack didn't sleep. He sat with a rifle across his knees, eyes on the door, ears tuned to every creak of the timber. Behind him, Lena lay curled in his coat, her breathing ragged at first, then steadier with the fire's warmth. Jack knew the danger wasn't over, but at least for one night on the wild frontier, a woman who'd been stripped of everything had found shelter, and a man who thought he'd lost his reason to care found himself standing guard again, not for an army, not for pay, but for a single, fragile life. The next morning, pale light slipped through the cracks of the cabin door and pulled Lena from a fitful sleep. She sat up quickly, clutching Jack's worn coat tighter around her shoulders, eyes still streaked red from the night before. Jack had already been up, stoking the fire and brewing coffee in his dented tin pot. He didn't press her with questions. He simply set a piece of leftover cornbread in front of her and waited. At last, Lena spoke, her voice rough and low, scraped raw from thirst and fear. 3 boys, one named Wade. The words made Jack freeze. He knew Wade, the reckless son of a ranch hand, always hanging around the saloon, always sniffing for trouble. But in Lena's voice there wasn't just anger. There was the trembling edge of someone who had just escaped a trap, but could still hear the mocking laughter behind her. She told it slowly, haltingly. Yesterday she had walked the road near town, hoping to find work, maybe trade a sack of corn for food. 3 young men stopped her, jeered, yanked the sack from her hands, and tore at her dress until it hung in rags. They laughed, she whispered, staring into the fire. They threw the corn in the dirt, like they were throwing away my soul. Each word landed like a blade, cutting through the silence, making the small cabin feel larger, colder. Jack listened, his hand tightening around the tin cup until his knuckles whitened. He could see those boys in his mind faces still boyish, but eyes already hardened with cruelty. He didn't answer, only nodded once when Lena finished with a quiet, "Final line, I have no one. Nowhere to go." He didn't ask more. His reply was simple, "Stay here, until you decide where else to go." Then he pulled a pair of old socks from a trunk and handed them to her. "These'll make it easier on your feet." Lena hesitated, then slipped them on over her cracked heels. She didn't say thank you, only gave a small nod, as if she still couldn't quite believe kindness came without a hidden cost. The morning passed in a tense quiet. Jack went out to check the fence line, and Lena followed, her eyes darting to every sound in the wind. When Jack gripped the pliers to twist a strand of wire tight, Lena stood close, clutching the hammer he'd handed her. She gripped it so hard her knuckles turned white, not so much to help, but as if she needed the weight of a weapon in her hands. By midday, they stopped at the creek. Jack watered the horse while Lena washed her torn feet. Even then she kept her back pressed against a cottonwood trunk, never leaving her blind side exposed. Jack noticed and said softly, "There's no one out here. You don't have to keep looking over your shoulder." Lena didn't raise her head. "I keep looking. If I don't, I'll fall again." Jack understood. The bruises on her arms, the rope marks on her shoulders, those weren't just wounds. They were memories that refused to fade. Back at the cabin, he set out a scrap of cloth and needle for her. She took them without a word, sat on the porch, and stitched in silence. Her fingers trembled at first, then steadied. The stitches were rough, but Jack noticed her eyes no longer darted away quite as often. That night, Jack sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, Lena curled by the fire inside, the glow washing across her tense face. Every snap of a twig in the woods made her flinch, eyes wide, waiting for a shadow to break through the door. Jack glanced in at her and said in a low, steady voice, "If they come, I'll know before they step foot in the yard." Lena pulled the blanket tighter, didn't answer, but her chest rose and fell a little easier. In that silence, Jack realized the cabin was no longer only his refuge. It had become a small fortress for 2 wounded souls, one man trying to bury the past, one woman trying to survive the present, both alert, both braced, because on the western frontier, The night was never truly safe. 2 days later, Jack decided he had to ride into town. He didn't tell Lena the real reason, only said he needed supplies. But in his heart, Jack knew this trip was about more than nails or a sack of cornmeal. He needed to know whether Wade and his gang were bragging about what they'd done. Only by facing it head-on could he plan what came next. The road to town was coated in red dust, the wind spinning small whirlwinds across the plain. Jack rode in silence, his back straight, but his mind heavy as stone. When he arrived, the town was still waking. A few folks swept their porches. A wagon rattled by with hay. Jack tied his horse outside the saloon. The smell of old whiskey and smoke drifted out, mixed with bursts of laughter. He stepped inside, ordered black coffee, and took a seat in the corner where he could see the whole room. It wasn't long before they showed up. 3 young men swaggered through the door. Wade led them, that crooked grin carved on his face. Jack recognized him instantly. They spoke louder than they had to, telling stories for everyone to hear. Laughing like humiliating someone was nothing more than a harmless pastime. Jack stayed still, silent, but his eyes followed every move, every smirk, and inside him rose not rage, but a strange wave of sorrow, not for the boys, but for those who might suffer at their hands, and for Lena, who would carry their cruelty like a scar she couldn't shake. When Wade's eyes landed on him, the laughter faltered. Jack only lifted his cup, drank slowly, and set it back on the scarred table. His gaze didn't flinch, didn't burn with fury, just calm and unyielding, like forged steel. That was enough. Wade's smirk twitched, slipped for a heartbeat. Jack knew then he didn't have to speak a word. His message had already been delivered. He knew their faces, and he wouldn't let this go. On the ride back, Jack let the horse walk slow. The wind pressed against the streaks of gray in his hair. In his mind, he heard Lena's words again, "I have no one." And he thought no one deserved to carry such fear and shame simply for being weaker. Compassion swelled in his chest, not only for the Apache woman left with nothing, but for himself too, for he knew the taste of loss, of emptiness, all too well. When he returned, Lena was on the porch, needleworking through torn cloth. At the sight of Jack, she stood quickly, eyes sharp with question. "You saw them?" Jack only nodded. He didn't want to plant more fear in her. Instead, he pulled out a chair, laid his Winchester across the rough table. "Do you know how to use one?" he asked. Lena shook her head, shoulders stiff, as though afraid of the weapon itself. Jack sat beside her, voice low. "Steady a gun is like the needle in your hand. Used right, it protects you. Used wrong, it hurts you." He showed her step by step how to load, how to hold the stock firm, how to breathe before squeezing the trigger. Her hands trembled at first, eyes refusing to meet the sights. Jack didn't push. He only placed his rough hand over hers, steadying the weight, letting her feel his warmth. Finally, she pulled the trigger on an empty chamber. The click rang out sharp. Lena flinched, then lifted her eyes to his. And for the first time, there was something besides fear in them. The first flicker of trust. That afternoon, Jack brought her along to mend the north fence. Simple work replacing rotted posts, stretching wire taut. At first Lena hovered, unsure, but then she lifted the spade herself, set posts with clumsy effort. Sweat rolled down her brow, dirt streaked her patched dress, but she didn't quit. Jack watched, and in her awkward movements, he saw determination. She didn't want to stay a victim forever. By sundown, they sat together by the new fence. Jack poured her a tin of water. She drank, then spoke softly. "This place doesn't feel like hiding. It feels like—" She left it unfinished, eyes on the open field. Jack understood. The cabin, once a hollow shell after his wife's death, was beginning to feel like something more. not just shelter, but a place where trust was being stitched back together. Slow, but strong. That night, Jack took his usual seat on the porch, rifle resting across his knees. But when he glanced through the door, Lena wasn't curled tight in fear by the fire. She sat with her back straight, her face lit by the glow, breathing easier than before. Her eyes still searched the shadows, but not as frantically. Jack studied her, and a deep sympathy welled up. She was still afraid, but she was learning to stand again, and for the first time in years, Jack felt the cabin wasn't just a prison of grief. It could be the beginning of something new, a place where two wounded souls might slowly learn to trust once more. That night, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke. Jack sat on the porch, rifle across his knees. He was used to the chorus of crickets and the restless snort of the horses in the corral. But something was different. A pause in the night, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He rose, took a few steps into the yard, eyes scanning the dark line of trees at the edge of the pasture. From inside the cabin, Lena caught the look on his face. She gripped her blanket tighter and whispered, "Is someone out there?" Jack didn't answer right away. He raised a hand for silence, listening hard. Then it came the faint scrape along the fence, followed by a low, mocking laugh. Not travelers, not neighbors. Jack knew at once they had come. He turned back quickly. "Blow out the lamp. Don't let the light show." Lena nodded, rushing to snuff the flame. The cabin fell into darkness, save for the faint glow of dying coals in the hearth. She pressed herself against the wall, both hands trembling around the Winchester Jack had given her earlier. Her dark eyes shone in the firelight, wide and brimming like water in a storm. Outside, Jack moved quietly toward the corral. He saw two figures crouched low, fumbling with the latch. One of them, he was sure, was Wade the Stance, the hat pulled low, the swagger heavy with arrogance. Jack's heart thudded, but his hands were steady. He eased the door open and stepped out like a shadow cut loose, his voice carrying deep and hard. "Leave the gate." The men froze, caught in the act. Wade lifted his head, his crooked grin pale under the moonlight. "Evenin'." "Callahan," he drawled, pretending ease. "Just passing through." "Passing through, don't run through my corral." Jack's voice was flat, cold as iron. "Mount up and ride." One of the boys shifted uneasily, but Wade stood rooted, eyes locked on Jack. The night drew tight, like a wire stretched to breaking. Jack's fingers hovered near the trigger. Wade saw it. His smile wavered, but he pushed out words anyway. "Think you can keep her forever? She don't belong to you." Jack didn't reply. He only raised the barrel an inch higher. "Tonight, you ride out whole. But if you come back..." He let the silence finish the warning for him. The boy beside Wade tugged his sleeve nervously. "Not worth it," he muttered. Wade spat in the dirt, face twisted with frustration. After a tense beat, he swung back toward his horse. They mounted, disappearing into the trees, leaving dust and bitterness in their wake. Jack stayed still, listening until the hoofbeats faded. Only then did he lower the rifle and step back inside. Lena was still pressed against the wall, clutching the Winchester, her chest rising fast with every breath. When Jack slid the bar across the door, she finally asked in a hushed voice, "They gone?" Jack answered, his face grim, "But they'll be back." Lena sank down by the fire, still holding the rifle close. After a long silence, she lifted her head. Her voice was hoarse. "But steady, I won't run anymore." The words caught Jack by surprise. In her eyes there was more than fear now, there was a fragile but fierce resolve. He nodded slowly, then took his seat near the door, rifle resting across his thighs. "Then we'll watch together." That night stretched longer than any before. Every sound outside sharpened their nerves, the crack of a branch, the rustle of wind in the grass. Jack sat like stone, eyes fixed on the dark. Lena, at first coiled tight, gradually straightened, her gaze also fixed on the door. They spoke little. Only the pop of the fire and the sigh of the wind filled the cabin. Yet in that heavy silence, something bound them closer, a man who had lost his family, and a woman who had lost her dignity. Both now understood survival meant standing side by side. By dawn, pale light crept through the shutters. Jack was still at the door, eyes bloodshot but hands steady on the rifle. Lena had dozed off, sitting upright, the Winchester cradled against her chest. Jack knew then this wasn't just their first standoff with Wade. It was the moment Lena chose to stop running. From that night forward, they would share the burden, trading turns at the watch. The cabin was no longer just a refuge. It had become a fortress guarding not only their lives, but the fragile trust just beginning to take root. The rain began just as darkness swallowed the prairie. At first it was only a few drops tapping against the tin roof. Then it grew into a steady downpour. The sound hummed like the earth itself, whispering, drowning out even the wind in the trees. Inside the cabin, Jack stoked the fire, its orange glow flickering across his weathered face. Lena sat close, her black hair damp and hanging loose over her shoulders, her eyes carrying something different now. Not only worry, but the need to be heard. She hesitated, then asked softly, "Have you ever lost everything?" Jack looked up, holding still. She went on, "Family, land, even your name, all gone." Her voice trembled but was steady, as though she'd swallowed this pain too many times. "I left it all in the South. Only these hands and the scars remain." Jack didn't answer right away. In the drumming rain, he heard himself in her words. He too had lost. One spring, when fever swept through, he buried his wife with his own trembling hands. Since then, the cabin had been an empty shell, a place to outrun memories rather than to live. At last, he set his rough hand on the table, his voice low and gravelly. "Yes, I lost it all too. But I still get up every morning, mend the fence, feed the horses, because if I don't, this land will leave me behind." Lena studied him, the fire casting his shadow long against the wooden wall. In those gray-blue eyes she saw not only steel, but a quiet gentleness, like embers that never died. She whispered, "Here, I feel safe." It wasn't gratitude. It was a confession, a fragile sliver of trust offered, trembling but true. Jack didn't make promises. He only nodded and handed her a tin cup of hot coffee. "Drink. The night's a long one." Lena cupped it with both hands, fingers trembling until warmth seeped into them. She took a sip. The smoky bitterness filled her throat, anchoring her in this present moment, one without laughter behind her, without mocking eyes. Only rain, fire, and the steady presence of the man beside her. They sat for a long while in silence, listening to the rain drumming the roof. Lena leaned back against the wall, eyes drifting shut. Jack sat by the door, rifle within reach, but for the first time his shoulders didn't feel so tight. A fragile peace had wrapped itself around the little cabin. When the fire sank low, Lena quietly pulled her blanket closer to Jack. He looked at her, ready to speak, but she shook her head gently, whispering, "I don't want to sit alone anymore." In that moment, the space between them shortened. There was no urgency, no demand, only two wounded souls finding a place to rest. Jack shifted nearer, letting his warmth reach her. They didn't sleep early. The rain fell on, a rhythm like the backdrop of a sad but gentle hymn. Lena spoke of scattered pieces of her life flames that had consumed her village, nights spent fleeing through the forest, and the hollow silence when no one was left to call her name. Jack listened, never interrupting, only nodding now and then. a steady pillar for her words to lean against. When her voice faded and the fire sank to embers, Jack laid another log on. Flames leapt, lighting her face as she looked at him. For the first time, he saw peace in her eyes. She didn't say a word, but when she leaned her head against his shoulder, Jack understood the cabin was no longer just a stopover. It was beginning to feel like home. He slipped an arm gently around her shoulders, no longer out of duty, but out of connection. With the rain whispering around them, Jack realized he was living again not in the past, but in this moment, a rainy night, a resilient woman beside him, and the small, stubborn hope that tomorrow they would still be here, together. That morning, the rain had passed, leaving the prairie washed clean and the air filled with the scent of damp earth. Jack saddled the horse, slinging an empty grain sack and a leather pouch across its back for supplies. Lena stepped out onto the porch, her patched dress neat and clean, her dark hair tied back. There was still a trace of hesitation in her eyes, but her voice was firm. "I'll go with you." Jack studied her a long moment, then nodded. He knew stepping into town meant facing every gaze, and that choice was not easy for her. The road into town was slick from the storm, wagon wheels having carved deep ruts in the mud. Lena rode behind Jack, clutching the edge of his worn coat. She didn't tremble as she once had, but she was silent, as if holding her strength tight inside. Jack felt it, and kept the horse at a steady, slow pace so she wouldn't feel pressed. Town came into view, wooden storefronts, smoke rising from the blacksmith's forge, the grind of wagon wheels on gravel. But when Jack and Lena rode in, the mood shifted. People looked up from their sweeping and hauling. Some whispered, others fell quiet, but all eyes followed. Jack knew exactly who they were staring at. A white rancher bringing an Apache woman to town by his side that was a sight guaranteed to stir talk. Jack dismounted first, then reached up to steady Lena. His hand lingered on her back as they stepped into the general store. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke like a declaration she was not alone. The shopkeeper raised his brows when he saw them together, but said nothing, simply fetching flour, sugar, nails, and a spool of thread as Jack asked. Lena stood behind him, hands knotted together. A young man about Wade's age passed by, his smirk aimed at her with open mockery. Before Lena could shrink back, Jack shifted a step, his frame blocking her completely. His voice was low, iron-edged. "If you've got something to say it to me, not her." The boy muttered and slunk away. Lena looked up at Jack, her expression a mixture of surprise and relief. When they stepped back into the street, she whispered, "They look at me like I don't belong." Jack squeezed her hand lightly. "They can look, but no one lays a hand on you again. No one takes anything from you." They stopped at the blacksmith next, outside. 2 or 3 men leaned against the post, murmuring. Jack caught Wade's name in their talk, heard crude words about the girl at Callahan's place. He didn't turn, didn't answer, only led Lena onward, though his eyes burned like coals. On the ride home, Lena was quiet until at last she asked, when the rumors spread, "Will you regret letting me stay?" Jack didn't look back. His voice was steady. "No. You chose, and I chose. No one else decides for us." The words settled into the air like a stake driven deep. Lena said nothing more, but her hand tightened on the back of his coat, clinging not out of fear, but with new resolve. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low, painting the prairie in gold. Lena dismounted slowly, then turned back to face him. Fear lingered in her eyes, but beneath it was a spark of determination. "I won't leave," she said softly, yet clear. Jack stepped close, laid a hand on her shoulder. "Then this will be our home." That evening by the fire. Lena didn't retreat into the corner as before. She sat near Jack, her gaze steady on him as he worked. The rain was gone, but the silence inside the cabin carried a different weight now, not the chill of hiding, but the stillness of two people who had stepped into the world together, faced its stairs, and returned side by side. That afternoon, the sky hung heavy and gray, like a blanket pressing down. Jack was stacking wood by the corral when the sound of pounding hooves reached him. He looked up, heart tightening. 3 riders were cutting across the field toward the cabin, dust rising in their wake. Jack recognized Wade's stance immediately, flanked by 2 younger men. "Lena," Jack called, his voice low but firm. She stepped onto the porch, hand gripping the doorframe as she saw them. Jack handed her the Winchester, his eyes hard. "Stay inside. I'll deal with this." Lena nodded, but her dark eyes burned with a defiance he hadn't seen before. The riders pulled up at the edge of the yard. Wade swung down from his horse, swaggering forward with that crooked smile plastered across his face. "Afternoon. Callahan," he drawled. "I hear you've got something of mine in there." Jack stood his ground, rifle loose but ready. "She doesn't belong to you, and no one's holding her here." "She chose." The 2 men beside Wade chuckled. Wade tilted his head, voice slick with contempt. "Did she? Or is she too scared to speak at that moment?" The cabin door swung open. Lena stepped out, no longer hiding behind Jack. Her voice rang clear, stronger than he'd ever heard "I stay here." "No one forces me. I won't run again." The yard went silent. Wade's smile faltered. His voice turned sharp. "You don't know what you're saying." "Girl." Jack raised his rifle, sight fixed square on Wade's chest, his voice cut like iron. "She said it. Now it's your turn. Mount up. Or stay here in the dirt." The air was so tight it felt ready to snap. One of Wade's boys shifted nervously, pulling his reins back, not eager to see where this standoff might end. Wade's eyes locked with Jack's. For a long beat, no one moved. Finally, Wade spat in the dust, cursed, and spun back toward his horse. "This ain't over." Jack's voice was steady, cold. "It ends when you never set foot here again." Wade mounted and wheeled his horse, the others trailing after, their silhouettes swallowed by the evening haze. Jack didn't lower the rifle until the sound of hooves faded. When he turned, Lena was still standing, tall, hands trembling but her eyes blazing with new fire. They looked at one another, no words needed. She had chosen, openly, to stand by him. That night by the fire, Jack said, "We need this clear. Tomorrow we go to the sheriff." Lena was silent, fingers brushing the edge of the blanket. At last, she nodded. "I'll go with you." The next morning, they rode into town together. Sunlight glinted on watchful eyes. Whispers rose as they passed. Jack kept his shoulders square. Lena kept her chin high. Inside the sheriff's office, Elias Morton looked up from his desk. His lined face bore the weight of too many troubles. "Callahan," he said slowly, "I've heard the talk." Jack laid his rifle on the desk, voice flat. "Last night Wade Jensen and 2 others came onto my land. Threatened her. I won't let it happen again. You need to put it in writing." The sheriff sighed, eyes shifting to Lena. "Do you want to speak for yourself?" Lena straightened, her voice trembling but firm. "I want them to stay away. They stole my food, tore my dress, and dragged my name through the dirt. I won't allow it anymore." Silence settled heavy in the room. Sheriff Morton nodded slowly, picked up his pen, and began to write. "I'll send word to Wade's old man. If they try again, it won't just be warnings." Jack gave a single nod, his hand steadying Lena's shoulder as they walked out. Outside, townsfolk watched, whispering again. But this time, Lena didn't bow her head. She walked at Jack's side, her eyes straight ahead, as if she had finally found her ground. That night, back at the cabin, Jack took his seat on the porch with his rifle across his lap, but he no longer felt the weight of vigilance alone. Now he guarded for both of them. Lena came out and sat beside him, their shoulders brushing lightly, in the quiet beneath the stars. They both understood danger still lingered, but from now on, they would face it together, after weeks of strain. The danger finally eased. No more pounding hooves in the night, no more shadows of Wade or his men drifting near the fence. Around the cabin, the air felt lighter, carrying a calm that neither Jack nor Lena had dared to imagine. These days, they began to live differently, not huddled in fear, but as though this place had truly become a home. In the mornings, when sunlight slipped through the small window, Lena was often up first, stirring the fire and setting water to boil. The smell of coffee spread through the cabin. Jack would come in, his shoulders broad but his gaze softened at the sight of her bending over the iron pot. They shared a simple breakfast, cornbread, beans, sometimes a bit of salt pork. There was no longer the old rush or worry. Each bite, each breath stretched into something to savor. By midday, Jack worked the soil, preparing for new seed. Hands that once gripped rifles now held the weight of shovel and hoe. Lena walked beside him, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, kneeling close at the rows of damp earth. Their fingers pressed seeds into the ground corn from Jack, beans and squash from Lena. "We plant, not just to eat," she whispered, "but to remind ourselves there's still a future." Jack looked at her then, and in his eyes flickered a faith he thought long dead. In the evenings, Lena sat on the porch with needle and thread, patching Jack's worn shirts. Each stitch, though rough, was steady, as if she were mending not only fabric but her own torn life. Jack sat nearby, sharpening a knife or working on a saddle. They spoke little, but the silence between them no longer felt heavy. It was safe, like two rivers finally running together. At night, the fire burned low, and Jack would tell stories of his youth of the frontier, of war, of dust and loss. Lena listened, eyes shining, offering no judgment, only the quiet presence of someone who understood. Sometimes she shared her own fragments, the laughter of children in her village, the songs of her mother, the ruin of fire and scattering of her people. Together, they let the weight of the past soften into shared memory. One evening, as Jack folded a shirt she had patched, Lena raised her head. Her voice was steady, clear. "I'm not just here for shelter anymore. I choose to stay." Those words, "I choose to stay," rang in the cabin like a hymn. Jack held still, then set his rough hand over hers. "Then this isn't only my house. From now on, it's our home. Friends watching this story, I imagine your hearts feel warmed, as mine does, after all the storms and the grief. Two people once strangers have found their anchor. If this moment speaks to you, tap that like button, and leave a comment. I believe in renewal. Your support keeps these Western tales of humanity alive. But life on the frontier is never easy. Wade's shadow and the small-minded voices of the town still linger. Jack knows peace today may not last forever, yet unlike before, he no longer carries the watch alone. Beside him stands Lena, not a runaway anymore, but a woman who has chosen to build. Perhaps their next step should be to strengthen the fence, plant more seed, and, most importantly, step forward into the community. What do you think? Should Jack and Lena hold a small gathering at the town church, or invite a few trusted neighbors to share a meal, showing that theirs is not just a cabin in the woods, but a rightful home among others? That could be the way to anchor their place for good. At sunset, they stood on the porch, gazing at the small garden freshly sown. The soil had received its seed, just as their hearts had received each other. From now on, Each green shoot rising would carry the promise of renewal not only for the harvest, but for two lives once thought broken.